This is a video for how to go about creating your candy assembly through the bottom-up method in Fusion. You'll notice that on the left-hand side of the screen, I have Starburst candies of different colors that we've created in a previous video. And you have an example of a candy assembly we're going to build here in a second via the bottom-up method. So what we want to do is we want to say we have to put all of our candy together, and we're going to be eventually designing a candy case around 4 Starbursts put together. So in order to start a bottom-up assembly, we are going to have a blank design space, and we are going to hit save. And I'm going to call this, call this candy assembly. I already have it called candy assembly and over here, so I need to call this candy assembly 2. You don't have to put a 2 after it or whatever. I'm just going to say save. And you'll see we have a candy assembly. You have to save your design before you can actually start an assembly. And just to start out, we're going to start putting these together. Doesn't really matter the color order per se, but I'm just going to start off with orange. And what I want to do is I want to drag and drop this over. And when I drag and drop it over, you'll see that I have the option to rotate or to move along an axis. Now there are 6 degrees of freedom along the X, along the Y, along the Z, or around the X, around the Y, or around the Z. These are the 6 axis lines, or the 3 axis lines, and basically the 2 things you can do for each axis that you have. In this case, I want to rotate the object 90 degrees around the X axis. You can see where it moved. If I wanted to move it along an axis, I could click on one of these arrows and move it along an axis. Again, there's 6 degrees of freedom along and around the X, along and around the Y, and along and around the Z. Now I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And when we have that done, you're going to see this little arrow pointing down up here, which means we've grounded it to what we call like a parent assembly. And if I click on this and I drag it, it has 0 degrees of freedom. It cannot go anywhere. This would be what you would call, let's say, the cornerstone of the assembly. It's not designed to move anywhere. Now we're going to stack these vertically. So after orange, I'm just going to click and drag pink over. Let's go ahead and just drag pink, and you're going to see it's going to sit here in the middle, and I can hold down on this little dot to drag it around, move the object around a little bit. I can use my mouse wheel to zoom out. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, drag this over, and I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. Now, you'll notice this can move. Our grounded component cannot. So we're going to be taking the pink piece and moving it on top of the orange piece. We're going to go up to joint. And for motion, we want to make sure that we're in a rigid constraint. Now for position, I'm just going to kind of slowly start dragging my mouse over this pink piece. But if I hold down on the control key, I want you to notice it's going to start snapping around to each one of these dots. This can be a very convenient option. Now what I want to click on is the center dot. And as I come over, once again, I can just hold down on the control key and have it snap, or I can let off the control key and now it moves. I'm going to click on our center, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK. Now it looks like mine is just off just a little bit. Maybe I have different sizes from a previous one that I've done, but yours should stack up hopefully perfectly. The concept's the same of the bottom-up assembly. Next thing we'll do is I'm going to go to red. We're going to drag red out. I'm going to go ahead and try to get this out of the way a little bit. I'm going to drag it over. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this about 90 degrees, or 270 degrees in this case. It's totally fine. We're going to go ahead and say OK. We're going to go up to join. We're going to click on our centers, options, and it's going to flip and rotate, say OK. Now you can tell that these two, just by going to a right side view, you can tell that these two came from the same design. Maybe in the past I've done one and used smaller dimensions, but yours should all line up the same if you're using the same data from my class that I referenced in a previous video. My classes went in and took, 5 starbursts each and averaged each of these. So this is the data that should be within each one of those starbursts down here, the average width, depth, and height of a starburst. I might be using this from a previous design. Last thing we'll do is yellow. I'm going to go on ahead and drag and drop yellow out into the design space. I can click a hold of these arrows if I wish, and I can go ahead and rotate 90 degrees. Say OK. Now, notice up here when I go to joint, I could just hit the letter J on my keyboard as well and go to joint. Click on that top part. I'm going to click on my top part here. It's going to flip right up. Go ahead and say OK. Now, I want you just to notice that, I have some candies I've made in the past that are a little bit smaller. So theoretically speaking, within this assembly, we could go in and cut off edges just in this assembly of each piece, and all pieces would update. If I no longer want to see any of these joint icons that tell me I have 3 rigid joints, I can just turn off joint right here, and they will turn off. Let's make sure we hit the save button for our candy assembly. We're going to go ahead and say OK. So that is how you go about creating a bottom-up assembly of just your 4 Starburst candies put together before we would go in and create a case around the outside of that. So this has been a video for how to go about creating a bottom-up assembly and using a rigid joint command to create the assembly.